Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. With the ongoing pandemic, as well as the province's choices how to manage the pandemic, there's been no shortage of controversy about that. One of the conversations that's come up in the path of sorting through that controversy is there seems to be, at least in the public perception, a significant amount of confusion as to what sort of powers and what sort of authority the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, has under these circumstances. To sort through some of that confusion, we are extremely grateful to be welcoming Dr. Ubaka Ogbogu to the show, who is a professor with the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. And he literally is teaching this stuff. So he teaches health law and the administration of health law, among other things. So we're very grateful to have somebody as grossly qualified as he is on the show. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks, Nate. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, so to start with, what does the law actually say about the powers that the CMOH has, Chief Medical Officer of Health, we'll just call CMOH because I'm lazy. What are the powers that she has during a pandemic like the one that we're currently in?
Yeah, so, the Public Health Act is where you'll find the powers of the CMOH. And, this is a massive piece of legislation. And as you can expect from a massive piece of legislation, there are many things that are assigned to CMOH to do in that legislation. So she has some powers that are advisory in nature, where she's making recommendations to the minister. She has some powers that involve managing the public health system. So she coordinates the different medical officers of health, and they report to her. So it's like a hierarchy. The medical officers of health in the different regions are reporting to her, and then she's reporting to the minister. So there's that. And then there's powers that she has when there is disease in the community or where there's a public health emergency. Those are special powers. In the legislation, there's a section that says isolation, quarantine, and special measures. So that's kind of how to think of the powers. The way I like to think about it in my head is that they are, to use a sort of analogy of peacetime and wartime. She has some peacetime powers, and then she has some wartime powers. We have disease present, and we have to do some things to control the disease. Right? So the way it's set up is, in peacetime, her powers are largely in the realm of what I described as advisory and managing the system. There's no disease, but we're trying to stop disease from coming in. We're trying to prevent it. So she's managing a system where she has to make recommendations as to how to manage the system so that disease doesn't come in and we don't have public health threats. And then we have the special measures when there's disease, such as we have now, where there's COVID. And the legislation is very clear about what power she has then. Now, let's break it down in terms of how the power works. The first thing about the power is that it's direct, right? It doesn't go through anyone. She actually has the power to do essentially anything that she considers necessary to try and control the disease and stop the further spread of the disease, right? So there are special powers in the context when there's communicable disease present or where there's a public health emergency. She acts directly. So the power comes from legislature down to her directly, and she can use those powers to do whatever she feels necessary to address the disease or pandemic. That's the first thing about the power. The second thing about those powers is that they're fairly broad. They're quite broad. They can be used essentially to do whatever she considers to be necessary, right? Now, I think this is where people are getting hung up, is that people are saying, how can she have this kind of powers, But that's how the law is set up. We can talk about, why she has those powers, whether she should have those powers, But one thing is clear. If you look at the law and look at how it's set up, those powers are direct. They don't go through anyone. And she can, on the letter of the law, exercise them directly. And she has, in fact, done that because it's wartime. right? We have disease present. She's issued a variety of orders citing this particular section of the law, saying, I'm using my special powers to order that something happen, right? So that's how it's set up. Peacetime powers, wartime powers. Wartime powers, she's the general. She's in charge, right? That is very different from what actually probably happens in practice, but we're not there yet. We're simply talking about what exactly does the law actually say? And that is not controversial. You can take that to any court in the land. That's how they're going to read it. When it's peacetime, she's making recommendations, she's managing the system, she's making sure, everything works properly. When it's wartime, she becomes the general. She's giving commands, right? And she's saying, look, this is how things need to be because we need to stop this disease. Now, as with every general, of course, they have to consult with people, right? If you take that analogy a little bit further, say, there's war and there's a general commanding an army, they have to talk to Trudeau, right? They can't just be, let's march to war. They have to coordinate, But why would they then set it up that way? Because legislature understands that in the context of a disease outbreak in a community, where there's a public health emergency, right? And people disagree on this. Some people say, maybe that power needs to reside in a political office. But I think the thinking of legislature is where we have something that's a public health threat present and we're taking special measures, maybe we should depoliticize that process. We should give it to somebody who has the medical and scientific knowledge to deal with it, right? We should give them that power and we should give them the ability to make the call, right? That doesn't mean they cannot seek advice. As a matter of fact, doing everything that you think is necessary can mean seeking advice. You can say, look, I think what's necessary is to seek advice, to talk to the minister, to talk to all these people. But it doesn't change the fact that the law is very clear. There is only one general in that situation, and that is the chief medical officer or the medical officers of health, including the chief medical officer of health.
Okay, so just so I understand it correctly, we're going to go with your military metaphor, because I get accused of using metaphors all too often. So to sort of paraphrase it, Dr. Hinshaw, as the CMOH, has sort of the full access to the full arsenal, and she has all of the legal authorization to use that arsenal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it defines how she uses that arsenal. So she may make those decisions in consultation with other health professionals. She may make those decisions in consultation with municipalities. I mean, the list could go on and on and on and on. But the fact that she has access to that arsenal, there's no legal debate on that.
Yeah, it's not controversial at all. There shouldn't be legal debate on it, even though, we do debate all kinds of things, but there shouldn't be legal debate on it because it's very clear. And it's not all or nothing, right? There will be some decisions that she has to make that have nothing to do with politics, right? Or that might even be something that the government approves of. Take, for example, a provincial mask mandate. You might see how she might go, I think we need a mask mandate. And that doesn't necessarily conflict with the government's imperative to keep businesses open, right? So, she can go, I'm going to order a mask mandate. It's not in conflict. But in reality, you can see how in using her arsenal, she might go, wait, if I said close all the businesses, that might conflict with the government's agenda. So maybe I should talk to them, right? And that is encouraged. I think the Act sort of contemplates that relationship. But if you're the legislature that wrote this, you're thinking, there's disease in the community. Somebody has to be able to make calls, and they have to have the full backing of the law. And like you said, the full arsenal of authority to make that call. And that person is the medical officer of health, including the chief medical officer of health, right? So people sometimes forget that laws are not drafted to address everything under the sun. Laws are actually sort of cut and dry. They are boring documents. Legislation is usually boring. They define things from like 10 feet up above, from the sky. It's a big picture view, and they're trying to sort of generalize in a way that captures what they really want to achieve. But they do understand that they are setting sort of a high order goal, and in practice, there's going to be ways to implement it in the spirit of what they've said, right? So that is to say, one thing is clear. If the chief medical officer says her role in a pandemic is advisory, that is wrong.
Okay.
Right? Her role in a pandemic is more than advisory. She's the general, right? That's what legislation says. But if she says, in a pandemic, in order to exercise my role as a general, I do have to give advice and take advice. That's fair.
So would it maybe be a better choice of words to describe not the legal specifics of her role, but sort of the 10-foot up function of her role, to not say that she works in an advisory capacity, but in a perfect world, she works in a collaborative?
It should be collaborative. One hopes it's collaborative, right? But you can think of situations where, say, the government was acting in a way that is contrary to stopping the spread of disease.
Oh, I think we can.
Right. So you can imagine that happening, right? That is when you start to think about who gave her that power. It is not the political party in power. It is not the government. It is the people of Alberta, the legislature of Alberta, that represents people of Alberta, that give her that power. It is people saying, it's come to wartime. All bets are off. Somebody needs to shut this down. And we don't want that subject to political pressures and influence. Shut the disease down now. I think there are people who would agree, who are going to listen to this, who would agree that there's something desirable about that. No more messing around, right?
Yeah.
Shut it down, right? As we've seen in the context of this pandemic, there is a lot of messing around that's going on. And at some point, there needs to be someone shutting things down, right? Now, others might disagree and say, well, you can't shut things down when you don't have the kind of information the minister has, when you don't have the sort of a fuller perspective that the government has about how this might impact other areas. That is also a valid argument. But the government cannot collaborate with the chief medical officer of health in bad faith, right? They have to consider that in a pandemic, and I think I can't stress this point enough. I am going to stress it, but I can't stress it enough. In a pandemic, the most important thing is stopping the disease. Nothing else is more important. That is how these statutes are written. When you have disease, you can't have anything else functioning routinely. And I think we tend to forget that. Yesterday, 20 people died. 20 Albertans died. Right?
Yeah.
That's what disease does to a community. So when that is happening, what could be more important than stopping that disease? That is the power that the CMOH has. The power to return the community to a time where we can start to think about, where is this collaborative relationship? Right? If your house is burning, you don't want to go, well, let's do some consultation, consider the economy, maybe consider, how the house will look like if it burns down. You don't do that. What you do when a house is burning is you stop the fire.
Yeah.
Do you think that part of the confusion that certainly members of the public are experiencing, and I'm want to be very clear, I'm purely speculating at this point, but part of the reason why we haven't seen publicly Dr. Hinshaw exercise these powers to the extent that she potentially could, as I choose my words carefully, is there's a public perception that there's the guy in charge, and for better or for worse, for Alberta right now, that's Mr. Jason Kenney. And there are a lot of people, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, who don't have a thorough or robust understanding of what the laws actually are, how they translate, how they apply. So do you think there's a component of it that the reason why we're seeing a lot of these announcements and decisions being made and presented by elected officials as opposed to Dr. Hinshaw unilaterally is because there's a piece where you have to kind of navigate, well, I have all the power to do this, but everybody thinks that guy has the power. So if I just go and do this, then people are going to lose their minds, especially when she's on public record saying that she does her capacity as an advisory.
Right. So, look, it's not easy being a chief medical officer of health.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. And in a pandemic, people are going to speculate as to your motives, right? As they should. People are worried. Albertans are worried. But I think it's important to distinguish between disagreeing or agreeing with what the CMOH is doing and speculating as to why she's doing it. Okay. Right? The second thing is speculation. And as with every speculation, it could be completely bonkers, right? It's speculation, right? It's one thing for me to say, you have said personal responsibility is the way to go about this. I disagree. That is clear. I disagree. It's another to say, I think you're saying this because you're in Kenny's pocket. Speculation. Right? The second thing I think we should stop doing, right? Or at least we should do it when we're gossiping with one another. But you can imagine someone in her position being really hurt by that. Because what if those are not her motives, right? But it's natural for us to read motives out of what people are doing. And in a pandemic where the government is doing a lot of things that people disagree with, of course, people are going to speculate as to her motives. And for that, I think we really need to step back. Right, because the job of a chief medical officer of health is not easy. She has to consider, scientific evidence, medical evidence. She has to, balance that against other factors that are presented to her. She has to give advice, take advice, in making that call that a general has to make, right? Mm-hmm. And in doing that, she may not necessarily always do what we want. I have disagreed with her on many points. But I started to think to myself yesterday, I remember the first time when we started to hear about COVID, this was like March, April, and where she was very popular. And people were saying, shut schools down. And she said, no, I can't shut schools down. I have to consider the fact that, parents will now have to stay home. It might impact. She was saying the same kinds of things that she's saying now. So I'm starting to think she's actually that way. That's how she deals with problems, right? And so maybe this is not about someone controlling her so much as in, this is just her method, right? But at the same time, he has some reasons why people might speculate as to her motives. She is making decisions, right, that other public health experts disagree with. So people might start to think, are you really the one? Why are you not seeing what your colleagues are seeing? But it is easy for me as somebody who does not have all the information to make that criticism. She is seeing, she knows where the bodies are buried. She is seeing what's actually going on. So she has a better view of the system. So I'm going to give her that. But the other thing too is in making the decisions that she's making, she also is somebody who was hired by the government and who can be fired by the government. So it is possible for her to be thinking, if I disagree with them and they fire me, somebody else comes in and maybe the person just does the same thing or worse. Mm-hmm. At least I can have better control of the situation and I don't need to quit the battlefield in the middle of the war.
Now, do you think that's a potential flaw of the legislation as it exists in its current form? Because it's a little bit dissonant for me to say to someone, you know what, we're going to give you full authority over the whole arsenal. You get to decide when you're going to use the things. You have the full power to manage the whole thing. But if I don't like what you do, I'll probably fire you.
Right. As I said before, I think the legislation contemplates that the government will not be acting in bad faith in the middle of a pandemic. They wouldn't be firing the one person who can actually manage the pandemic, right? You would expect that that's how governments should function. And if they're going to do that, they're going to have to answer to the legislature, right?
Okay.
Which, do not forget, they're going to have to answer to Albertans. If you fire the chief medical officer of health in the middle of a pandemic, come election time, you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right? So I think we can take some, I don't necessarily see it as a conflict. I see it as somebody has to hire and fire the person.
Yeah.
It's the minister. That's fine. It's the government. They choose the person, they fire the person. That's fine. But once the person is hired, we've assigned them this task to take special measures in the pandemic. And we want the government to act in good faith and support that and respect that, right? And I don't think legislature will contemplate that because they've defined it so narrowly. It's only when there's war, which we don't have most of the time. I mean, how many years have we lived? How many decades have we lived without this war?
Oh, yeah.
It's our first pandemic since the AIDS pandemic, right? Now, we live there's so much peace times, but then there's this period of war, and we expect that the government will act in good faith and not want to fire its chief medical officer in the middle of it. So I don't think the legislature will be thinking, let's draft something where we're thinking of the chief medical officer fired all the time. That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking it's wartime. The government should want to stop the war. So the one time maybe that are wrong and the government is not stopping the war and actually fighting the general, right, doesn't mean the legislation was not drafted right. It doesn't mean we haven't set it up right. It just means the government is acting in bad faith.
Okay.
Right?
Well,
and there are ways to keep them in check. The chief medical officer, if it's true, as people are speculating that she's actually under pressure to act a certain way, can make a statement by resigning. Right? That sends a clear signal to Albertans that the government is interfering with the general during the war.
But doesn't that require Albertans to be aware that sort of this is, and hopefully there will be some more Albertans that are aware after this conversation, but in order for Albertans to recognize that the magnitude of a decision like that, were it to happen, they would have to be able to understand the enormity of the powers that she has at her disposal and the statement that she would be making. I mean, I don't think that there's anybody who would misinterpret her well, there probably is, but I don't think there's that many people that would misinterpret her resignation. But I worry that because so many people don't understand, there would be people that would say, oh, she was trying to take things in the wrong direction and somebody made her resign. Because there's always that perception that, well, if you know you're going to be fired, it's better to resign. And I think that there's definitely certain people who spin for this government that would probably take it in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's the risk you run, if you resign or if you're, fired, right? Mm-hmm. I was on a provincial board and the government made some changes to the legislation. I didn't like it, so I resigned. And I resigned with an open letter where I wrote it to the legislature, essentially. And I said, this is why I resigned. And I put it up on Twitter, right? So that people know why I resigned. And of course, you get attacked and people say all kinds of things, but you're clear on why you resigned. Now, keep in mind that our democracy is an act of trust. We can't all get together in the Legislative Assembly and govern. So we give this trust to the government to govern, right? That trust, as we've seen, can totally be thrown in the trash. Mm-hmm. It's and the way we reaffirm that trust, or decide that we like the trust being broken, is through elections. So it's perfectly okay for the legislature to say, we trust Dr. Hinshaw where there's war, where we have disease in the community. And if the government is not supporting her direction as the general, then the polls, will decide that next, right? Because I think firing her in the middle of a pandemic would be an act of bad faith, right? It would also, if she's fired for the wrong reasons, be something that she can fairly confidently say to Albertans directly, I was fired for the wrong reasons. And there are people who won't believe her. We live in a very, polarized society. That's fine. But there are people who also say, you know what? We can see where you're coming from. But all this is speculation. It's possible that she's actually dealing with a pandemic exactly the way, that's my daughter, like banging things in the kitchen. It's possible she's dealing with a pandemic exactly the way she thinks it should be dealt with, right? And I take no issue with the notion that this might actually be what she wants, or even that this is not what she wants, but she's being forced to go along with it. The thing I want people to really understand from this conversation is there's no question what her legal powers are in a pandemic. And it's not advisory. But in implementing it, in the reality of it, it could be anything, right? Because reality sometimes works differently.
Well, and I think there's, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I think there's also an argument to be made that because, she can make the decisions and she can say, continuing on with the military metaphor, I want you guys to go take that hill, and if you run into any bad guys, I want you to shoot them. That still relies on the soldiers that are taking the hill and pulling the triggers on those weapons to go, okay. So while she is able to issue orders, I think there's probably an argument to be made that she does need a certain degree of buy-in from the people who are going to be communicating those orders to the troops, and certainly a heavy amount of buy-in from the people who are going to be executing those orders.
I completely agree. And I think, that's, we're really using this analogy. We're using this metaphor to,
We're going to beat it to death is what we're going to do.
I think we're going to get complaints from actual soldiers saying this is not how it works.
Probably.
But I completely agree with that. This is why, when you said it's a collaborative thing in practice, I agree with that. But as I said at the beginning, the letter of the law is the letter of the law. If people are having an argument about that, they are wrong to say something different from what I've described about the letter of the law. But in practice, she has to marshal the troops. No general can just back orders without actually carrying people along, in a way that they support the general. You can't just tell people to just, this is not like Game of Thrones. We're not just going to, hold our spears and just keep running till we catch the enemy, right? So this kind of warfare requires doctors, nurses, the government. It requires a lot of resources that needs to be marshaled. Now, the way I like to think about it is there are some decisions that don't require that can be made where, it's not just, it's not about usurping the government. It's about saying to the government, we should do this because it doesn't cost you anything, and, I encourage you guys to go along with it, right? She's the general. She can be direct. Let's go along with this because it's going to be good for you. She also has, like, as with every person who holds a position like that, some advocacy to do, some, getting people on our side to do, right? Mm-hmm. So those decisions are fairly easy. Not every decision will be controversial. So, for example, if you say to the government, I really think it's time to, reopen the economy. Of course, they will love that. They will go, let's go. Let's go, right? We should really tell people about masks. There's nothing, to be lost by that. We should have a mask mandate. Sure, let's go along with that. And then she says, we should shut things down. And they're like, wait a second. We're not following you down this path, right? And then they can have a conversation about that, right? Mm-hmm. But for many of the decisions that she will make in the context of a disease outbreak, the government will not necessarily disagree. And she can consult with them, and it won't be like, we're fighting about it. As she has done. If you actually go on the website, she has produced orders like that, where she's consulted with the government and come up with something, and we march on. When schools were closed, right, the first time, things like that have happened. So I think you're right to say that she just can't just wake up and just start issuing orders without, no general actually behaves like that. But when it comes to whether she is the general or not. What does the law say about that? That is clear. But in reality, as she's doing her job, she of course needs to take a 360 view of the system and work with people. Now, here's an interesting thought experiment. What if there's something she wants to do? She believes so strongly in this, and the government is so unreasonably against it. It's an intractable situation. What happens? Well, that's the nuclear option. We all have that hill we're going to die on.
Mm-hmm.
You resign, or you get fired.
Yeah.
Or you do it and see what happens. These are all options that that are there. She can do, like, I shut down every business in Alberta because I think that's the right thing to do. And then the minister comes out and goes, "How dare you? I fire you." That's how these things work. I mean, it's not as if we haven't seen those things. We're seeing it in the United States, for example, right? Where Trump doesn't like, what someone is doing. He goes, I'm going to fire you and replace you. But people have taken positions where they've said, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to take that position. And she has that power to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think I do very much sort of empathize for her position, because I remember when the big peak of people were getting the Dr. Hinshaw T-shirts and the mugs and all of the things, and that was during the first wave. And for people who look at how the historical movement of pandemics go, there's always a second wave, and it's always worse. And I remember thinking back then, oh man, in like 4 months, it's going to suck to be her so hard. And then when we take a look at how this government does business, I mean, I empathize with her, because she's working with a health minister who has gone to people's driveways and yelled at them. So the threshold of what's he going to do today is probably not the most comfortable ground to stand on, I'll say. So, yeah, what do you see any sort of, is this the best setup that we can get for this stuff? Or is there would you tweak the model?
Gosh, that's a great question. And believe it or not, there's a debate about that. I think it's one of those sort of catch-22 situations. There's no perfect scenario here. If you vest powers in the minister to be the last word on what happens in the context of a public health threat like this, the minister, of course, will have access to, doctors, scientists, and can make those decisions by taking a full system view of the matter. There's advantages to that, the full system view, the accountability that comes with that, because the minister is accountable not just to the cabinet, but also to the legislature in a much more direct way, but also, much more visible and accountable to the people. So there's advantages with that. But we've also seen it go wrong, right? Where, you put politics over health and science. We've seen it, especially in the US. We've seen it in Alberta recently, right? Where it's very clear that we shouldn't be relying on personal responsibility, but we keep preaching the message of personal responsibility, right? In the US, we've seen it with, all the bizarre behavior of Trump, and, Fauci saying this is not what should happen, and Trump saying this is what should happen. And you see how there's arguments against resting it with politics. But then we see the opposite of which is what we have now. You rest that power with a medical officer of health. And then there's also this sort of thing about, where does she get off, and, she needs to work with the system, and she doesn't have a 360 view, and all of the things, So there's no good answer.
Okay.
There's no good answer to that. There's no place you're going to place it where there won't be advantages and disadvantages. What do I support personally? So interesting side note. What I did for my PhD was study historical epidemics, smallpox in particular, and how the law functions to regulate it, right? And this is not the first time this war has been fought. Chief medical officers of health and medical officers of health fight with the government all the time. There was one popular fight in Toronto between the mayor of Toronto, Mayor Church, and the chief medical officers of health, the provincial medical officers of health at the time, over whether or not people should be vaccinated for smallpox. Big fight. The church was an anti-vaccinationist. These fights happen all the time, but I think it should rest. I think the power should rest, as it does in our legislation, with the chief medical officers of health and medical officers of health. I think so because, first, I think you need people to be able to, who have good knowledge of the science and, the medicine and the public health issues around it, to be able to react very quickly to your house is on fire. When your house is on fire, who do you call? Who do you want to be there? The fire service. You don't call the minister of fire. You call the fire service. That's what you do. That's what you do when there's a fire, your house is burning, right? That doesn't mean that, when they get back after putting out your fire, they don't write a report to the minister of fire saying, well, this is what we did today. And, if there's some direction you can give us about how we might have done right or wrong, let's hear it. But the house is on fire, you get the fire service involved. So that's why I support the model. It's not like you wouldn't have the fire service, like driving there going, oh my God, I hope we don't spray water on someone else's house. I hope we don't, it's not like they don't do that, but there's a fire burning. You need to put it out. So yeah. I support the power resting with the chief medical officer of health. And I support even an amendment of legislation that sort of says that sort of gives her a little bit more independence with respect to some of those influences and really emphasizes that the government is directed to act in good faith because it is the disease first, everything else later.
Mm-hmm. Two more questions for you. The first one is, to be very clear, pure speculation. But one of the things that I've kind of wondered about, and I'm curious if there would be any potential legal ramifications had Mr. Kenney or Mr. Shandro decided to go with this route. Is there an argument to be made that at the beginning of the pandemic, they could have said, hey, here's the deal, guys. I'm a lawyer, I'm a career politician, whatever the case may be. I don't know anything about epidemiology. I don't know anything about medicine. We've got this lady over here, though, and she has the power to address all of these things. So what we're going to do is we're going to manage the government stuff, and we're going to get out of her way. She's in charge of the entire pandemic response. Dr. Hinshaw, over to you. To me, that would have been a great strategy because not only would it have made it clear where the power and decisions were coming from, but it would have also, from a purely political standpoint, it would have given the minister and the premier and the rest of the government a little bit of plausible deniability to say, hey, you know what? We know those businesses got shut down for a while. It really sucked for everybody. But that was Dr. Hinshaw's decision. We're committed to rebuilding the economy, yada, 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 yada. The way that they've built it with Kenney doing his little PowerPoint presentation, he owns this. There's no getting around that. Right. Do you think that is there any legal reason why they couldn't have done that? And in your personal opinion, do you think that might have been a better strategy?
I actually think you've described what happened. I think later when historians write this period, they're going to draw a timeline. That's exactly what you just described. I think when the pandemic started, Dr. Hinshaw was front and center. She became a folk hero. People were putting her on shirts and putting tattoos on. Why was that? Because she was out with, she was seen as the person managing the pandemic. I think that was, up until maybe May, that was undeniable.
Yeah, for sure.
You couldn't mention anyone else. So in that time, we're not having this debate. Nobody was talking about what's our powers. Things started to get dodgy for her and for Albertans the minute it became clear that the government was starting to get antsy about the economy, right? The pandemic got to their agenda and was not just attacking Albertans now. It was attacking the agenda. So that's when they got involved. That's when they took over the narrative. That's when we started to debate whether she has this power, doesn't have that power, what's going on, right? And, maybe that's the way it is. At some point, a disease outbreak is going to push against the thing that the government cares about, and the government is going to push back. Maybe that's the conversation that you call collaboration. Maybe that's the way these things are supposed to work. Maybe we will get to a point where the government reaches its own breaking point. But it is undeniable that when this started, Dr. Hinshaw was seen as the final authority on what Albertans should know and do about this pandemic, and we trusted her as such. And her job was in many ways not easy then, but easier than it is now, right? Because now she has now got this pandemic. The management of the pandemic has got to the point where the government's imperatives are being interfered with, and they are pushing back. And that's why we're having this debate. I think when we get to this kind of point, the government should still trust her. They should still say, the sooner you can get this under control, the better for our economy, the better for all the things we care about. That's where the government, I think, went wrong. The government has failed to realize that there's no economy without ending the disease. And that's not me, that's not my expertise. But every person who knows something about this that I have read says we're not getting any economy without this disease ending, right? It's just that the government doesn't get that.
It's stunning to me. Yeah, it's stunning to me. I mean, we saw an announcement yesterday in Calgary, one of the larger restaurants and venues, announcing that they were going to be closing of their own volition because they couldn't, in good conscience, continue to be a part of putting people at risk. And it's stunning to me that the people who are their livelihoods are dependent on this. They're the ones who are recognizing. We got a problem here and we need to take drastic measures. And it seems like the government is not picking up things as clearly as them. And I mean, I saw a tweet from a guy who owns a restaurant just a couple of days ago where he was using some strong language, and he said, do the circuit breaker now because it hurts to lose business in November. Yes, it hurts more to lose business in December around the Christmas season and the holiday season. So let's get it out of the way. And it's fascinating to me that for a government that claims to be business driven, they're not listening to the business.
Yeah, I don't get it too. And, we actually have examples of countries that have done this. They've focused on the pandemic first, and now they're back to their lives, right? New Zealand is sort of a classic example. But the other thing too is that I don't think government understands that people's behavior in a pandemic is not optimal for the economy. My behavior, I'm somebody who likes to buy stuff. Depending on how you look at it, it can be one of my greatest assets or it can be one of my weaknesses, but I buy stuff, right? Yeah. The mall is one of my favorite places, but I'm not going near a mall, right? And even if I go near a mall, I'm not like doing what I usually do, which is like random window shopping and then I buy something I don't need. It's just not. People's behavior in a pandemic changes. The economy is not front and center in their minds, except if they're the ones who actually own these businesses. But they're also worried about the costs that they have to deal with if they ignore public health. If you keep it open, you're going to have to deal with extra precautions for, making sure the safe space that you're running the business is safe. So whatever you're bringing in, you're going to be spending anyway on these precautions. So I don't, again, it's not my area, but I don't know that if you talk to people who actually study this stuff, you're going to hear from them that, look, the best time to run a business and an economy is during a pandemic. I don't think anyone's ever going to say that because it's nonsensical, right?
Unless you're selling toilet paper, and in which case, apparently, that's a great business model.
That's a great business, right? There's a saying in public health, it's salus populi, suprema lex. The welfare of the people, the health and welfare of the people is the highest law. I really think people forget that. If we're not healthy, we can't do anything else.
My last question for you, and you gave me a bit of an opening to it where you were talking about people behaving differently. We in Calgary recently saw on the weekend a protest of, depending on whose numbers you go with, anywhere from 150 to 400 people. I'm kind of leaning towards the 150 myself, but of people claiming that their constitutional rights were being infringed on by the measures that have been taken, including masking and restrictions on the number of people that can get together in places, and that the governments were breaking the law. I know where I stand on that, but I would love to get your take. Are there laws that are being broken with the masking rules from municipalities? Are there laws that are being broken with the restrictions on people's ability to go places in large groups and sporting events and all of that stuff? What?
So do you want a short answer or the long answer? Let's start with a short answer and then do a little bit of the long answer. So the short answer is no.
Okay.
The long answer is whenever government enacts rules that interfere with people's liberty or with their person, or in some cases with their life, but no, that's not implicated here. So your liberty or your person, your sort of personal autonomy or your bodily integrity, that of course raises questions as to it's government, it's the greatest. They have such incredible power, and they're going against you as an individual. So on the face of it, they've interfered with something, right? And those interferences are part of the story of living in a society like ours. Do I want to stop at a traffic light? No, I want to ram straight through because stopping is not good for my fancy car and do I drive, right? But do I stop? Yes. Why do I stop? Because the government has made some kind of decree that I stop. I don't like that, and so that sort of tension between what is good for you personally and what the government can make you not do for the benefit of the community is always there. And when the government does it, it is factually speaking an interference with your life. Asking you to put on a mask when you don't want to put on one is factually speaking an interference with your bodily integrity, right? But that's not how our laws and our constitution and our human rights laws work. Our human rights laws understand this, social contract. I'm going to use that term because that's what people recognize it. It understands this social contract, this idea that your individual perspective is important, but it doesn't trump community welfare and justified uses of government power to try and make sure that this your individual thing that you're on about doesn't become the bane of society, right? That's how human rights laws function. It is not whether or not the government has interfered with your body or your freedom. It is whether they've done so justifiably, whether they have a good reason for doing so for the benefit of the community. And the government has to justify this all the time. When the government does interferes with your rights, you can go to the courts and the courts will go, first question, have your rights been interfered with? Check, yes. Did they do it for good reason that is consistent with the values that we hold there, including the values of being a community, where we might sometimes have to interfere with your rights in order to get ahead, right? And the answer to that, in the question you asked me with masks and all of that, is yes. I think the answer will be yes. I think if you go to a court and say, they asked me to put on a mask to stop the spread of disease, and the biggest inconvenience to me is wearing the mask. But the benefit to society is that I don't spread disease to someone else. They'll tell together, F out of there. Like, what are you talking about? Of course you should put on a mask. That will be the conclusion. I'm as sure of this as I can ever be, that I will stake my professional career on it. I don't think you're going to ever get a different answer from the courts. There are historical examples that, where people have gone to court saying the government sought to vaccinate me and I don't want that in my body. And the government always wins. We have to vaccinate you to stop the spread of disease, right? So that's one thing people need to know. Your rights are interfered with by government all the time. As I'm sitting in my house right now, talking to you, I am subject to over 1,000 laws sitting in front of you here right now. This microphone is regulated. This call that I'm making with you is regulated. If I go get myself lunch, that's regulated. How I turn on my stove, how I turn on my lights, it's all regulated. I'm a mess of government regulations. Do I like it? Maybe not.
That's an excellent point.
Right. But do I like it? No, maybe not. But what can I do? Because we need to have a community where we all live and share, and that's how this stuff works. Now, here's one little thing I should add to that. Even if the court finds that the government doesn't have good reason for making you put on a mask, let's just go with it as a hypothetical. Let's say they say no good reason for doing this. Our constitution actually allows the government to say, notwithstanding what the court said, we're going to make this a political matter. We disagree with the courts, notwithstanding what they said, we're going to force this on you and test it at the elections. That's how our system works. Your rights are interfered with, but were they interfered with for good reason, justifiable reasons for placing a limit on you for the sake of our society? And if the answer to that question is yes, you don't have any case. But if the answer is no, they have interfered wrongly with you, the government can take it one step further. They can go, well, let's test that in an election.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think that I didn't know the last part, so that's kind of cool. I appreciate that.
They don't use it often. But it can happen.
That's a big gamble.
Yeah. They can say we're gonna call it in an election.
Well, and I think there's no shortage of examples in Canadian history where governments have done things that people have disagreed with, but that were, in and of their own right, entirely legal. And with the benefit of hindsight, some of those things we look at and we go, oh, we shouldn't have done that. And some of them we look at and we go, well, given the circumstances at the time, that was the best decision that we could make. So it's very complicated and very nuanced when you have the hindsight piece. But I just wanted to get the legal argument on whether or not charter rights are being violated
by.
I love that you didn't even let me finish the sentence.
Wear a mask. Wear a mask. Your charter rights are not being violated. As a matter of fact, I would go as far as saying, just care for your neighbor, for goodness sake.
Yes.
Everything is not about the charter, right? Everything is not about law and the charter. It's simple. You only have to wear the mask when you're in contact with other humans. If you're at home, don't wear a mask. But if you're going to go out, you're going to go buy, something.
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper, a pair of shoes. In the middle of a pandemic, there's somebody trying to sell you these shoes. That person has hopes and dreams and a life and a family and people who care about them. And the only way you can protect them is to put a piece of something covering your face. And you're going to yell at the wind and at the government. How did we get here?
It's fascinating to me because I see, I through my work, I spend pretty much 12 hours a day wearing a mask. I have asthma, and I do just fine. So I personally really struggle with the whole I don't want to wear a mask. Well, okay, I get that. I don't think anybody's like, yay, we're wearing masks today. But your point about we shouldn't have to be mandated to do the kind thing and the right thing, I think really underscores where the whole conversation's at. Is there anything else that you would like people to know or be aware of in regards to the context of the conversation around the powers that the Chief Medical Officer of Health possesses, or how they can use those powers before I let you go?
Well, I think we've covered all of it, much of it, if not all of it. But I just want to sort of remind people that there are no easy answers in a pandemic, and we should really be kind to one another and kind to the Chief Medical Officer of Health as well. I don't know about the government. They're making so many bad decisions in my view, but the Chief Medical Officer of Health, I'm sure, is a person who does not have an easy task. And, I jumped on her response yesterday because I thought it was misleading. But at the end of the day, I can understand why she gave that response. It was in the heat of the moment. So we need to be kind, but at the same time, insistent that our government do the right thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to leave people who are listening to this with, sort of the message of empathy and kindness always works. I don't know if it works on Twitter, but it does work. And yeah.
I have to say though, I have seen there is, as much as people deride Twitter, there is no shortage of examples of incredible kindness and incredible compassion. We've got an episode that we're going to be releasing very soon where there's a gentleman who is using social media and Twitter to connect people who are experiencing incredible hardship, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the government, with people who have the means and the desire to help. So I think that there is, it's no different than any tool. It's the intent of the user that defines the outcome.
100%. And it's how I find someone like you in like an hour, and we have set up a podcast. It's great. Exactly. I love Twitter. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. If people want to sort of get more of your opinions and your thoughts on things, what's your Twitter handle or any other contact information that you're comfortable sharing?
So it's at my two names as one name. So at Ubaka Ogbogu. Okay. Yeah, I'm really easy to find. If you go to the U of A law website, you can find me there, and my Twitter handle is on that page. But if they just go Ubaka Ogbogu on Twitter, they can find me as well. I spend most of my time on Twitter these days because, it is what it is. It's the only fun we're having. So yeah. They can reach me by just sending a message on Twitter or by using my contact information on the faculty website to email me or something.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you, Nate. That was great. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, please consider signing up as a monthly supporter at our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/TheBreakdownAB. And if you're listening to the audio version of our podcast, please consider leaving us a review and a rating. And don't forget to like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at The Breakdown AB. Thank you for your attention.